Hey guys, and welcome to the 18th tutorial in our Python Language Basics course. Now that we know a little bit about what loops are and how they work, let's jump into some examples starting with while loops. Here we're going to start by creating a simple while loop and running it, of course. Then we'll talk about how to break out of a while loop using break statements, implementing extra conditions, and also we might as well throw in continue statements as well because the two kind of are somewhat related. So let's head on over to the code now. Right, the last cell we ran was the 16th cell. This was, or rather 16th tutorial. This was on our if statement variants. The first thing, as per usual, that we want to do is get started with a new cell here. Okay, so let's talk about where we might see loops in a program. Well, actually, I said in our intro to loops that basically most programs kind of run on a loop. So especially you'll see this with games. There'll be some kind of main game loop that is constantly cycling through, taking in player input, updating positions, detecting collisions, etc., and rendering graphics. So I think because games are easy to relate, we'll stick with those examples and we'll kind of simulate a basic game loop here. So we're really not going to get into anything fancy. All we're going to do is simulate player movement, specifically player movement to the right, which means we'll start at a position and we'll end at a position, and once we reach the end position, then that's kind of the end of the game. Okay, so we could do this pretty easily by starting with a couple of variables. So our start position is going to be 0, our end position is going to be, let's just say 5. Okay, and what we could do is just increase x position by 1 until we reach 5. Now, that's kind of annoying to do 5 times. Okay, like this, and then we'd reach the end. And what if our end position was like 500? Well, then we'd have 500 extra lines of code that we don't really need. So what we'll do instead is put this in a loop and then simulate that kind of behavior. Now, obviously in an actual game, this movement would be controlled by user input. So this would be like you press the right arrow key, you go to the right, left arrow key, go to the left, and so on and so forth. But we're not going to bother with that. Okay, so let's set up the loop to accomplish that task then. So pretty straightforward. All we need to do is start our while loop like this. We'll need some kind of condition. Okay, we'll get back to that in a second. And then we'll just increase x position by 1 with each loop iteration. Okay, so this condition can be pretty much anything we want as long as it returns true or false. Okay, and realistically, at some point in time, we should have some sort of break condition. We should make sure this loop won't run infinitely. So we need this condition to be something that will at some point return false. A fairly intuitive way of doing this would be something like, as long as the x position is less than our end position, then we'll keep the game running. So in this particular case, we are going to perform the check. If this returns true, then we'll execute the code, and then we'll do the whole thing over again. We cycle back up to the top, perform the check, execute the code, cycle back up, and so on and so forth. So how many times do you think this loop will run, considering that we're starting at 0 and ending at 5? Well, we should run 5 times, because we start at 0, increase by 1, so then it's 1, next iteration it's 2, 3, 4, and then finally, when x position is 4, we run this, we increase it to 5, we cycle back to the top, then we test this and it fails. Okay, it returns false. At that point, we exit out of the loop. And just to make things a bit clearer, I think I'll print some stuff out. So I'll just print out the x position here, and then once the loop finishes running, we're just going to print out something like you've reached the end. Okay? Now, note how, like if statements, in fact, this while loop looks very similar to an if statement. Specifically, I wanted to point out the indentation here. So again, Python is indentation heavy. We don't use curly brackets or anything like that, so the indentation is important. This is not part of the loop, but this code is. Also, what we really don't want to do is create the variable inside of the loop, like this, because then x position is just going to get stuck at 0 and then 1, and it will just do this infinitely. Okay, so that's not very good. Basically, anything that we don't need to be rerun while we're in the loop needs to be declared outside of the loop. Okay, so we can go ahead and run this, and it works just fine. We can see that we're printing out 5 of the numbers. We've reached the end, so we're good to go. Note, just make a quick side note that if you did the print before the x increase, you do 0 through 4, but essentially the result is pretty much the same. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this while loop. This works. That's totally fine. But realistically, in an actual game, likely there would be more win or lose conditions based on, rather than just based on your X position. So you might have to detect collision with other things or other non-player characters. You might accidentally fall off the end of the map. There might be like jumping. So there's lots of other things that you can do. In this particular instance, it might not be enough just to check to see if our X position is less than to the N position, because there will be other situations that should cause us to break out of the loop. Okay, such as let's say we are kind of detecting collision, okay, and we have an enemy at some point that we may or may not collide with. Okay, so I'm just going to create a variable, and I'm going to call this enemy position, and I'm going to set this equal to 3. So I know if we incorporate this code that I'm about to write, we will never reach the end position, but that's okay. Again, it's just a really simple example anyway. So what we're going to do here is we're going to, within our while loop, when we increase our X position, we then need to check to see if we're colliding with the enemy. Okay, so for that, we can do something like this. If our X position is now equal to the enemy position, okay, if that's the case, then we're going to print something like, let's say you collided with the enemy, okay, and then we're going to break. Okay, in that case, we should actually change this to, instead of you reach the end, it's just going to say game over. Okay, so what's going on here? What's this break statement, and why did we bother changing this? Well, the break statement is a way to prematurely break out of the loop. So if the break statement is ever reached, essentially this just exits the loop regardless of this. The break statement doesn't care about the test. It doesn't care about the state of the program. It basically just says, we reach this, so we need to break out of our loop. We need to exit out. Okay? So if this ever returns true, then we'll exit out of the loop regardless of our current X position. Okay, so this makes sense. If we collide with the enemy, then we want to essentially lose the game, so we're going to stop our main game loop. So let's see what happens here. Let's go ahead and run that. So we get to 1, 2, and then 3, and then it says you collided with the enemy and game over. So that's to be expected. Our enemy is clearly in the way, and as of now, we have no means to get around that enemy. Now, realistically, you'd probably have a way to avoid the enemy. Either you'd have some kind of like armor or a weapon you can use to defeat them, or you could just jump over them. Okay, so we'll actually kind of simulate jumping. We're not going to, again, taking controls or anything. What we'll do is we'll just come up with a really simple way to do this. We'll just say Y position is equal to 1. Okay, so we'll just pretend that we're, I don't know, flying or something. So we have a Y position of 1 instead of 0. So then what we can do instead is, when we get to the statement, okay, we're going to, instead of checking this right away, we're actually going to say if Y position, should be lowercase, if Y position is greater than 1, okay, we're going to continue. Okay, so what is this doing for us now? Well, essentially a continue statement forces us onto the next loop iteration. So if this continue statement is ever reached, we don't perform this check. Otherwise, if this continue statement is not reached, then we perform both checks. Note how this is if and if rather than if and elif. Okay, so that means both checks are always being performed unless the continue statement is hit. So if we get to here, okay, Y position is greater than 1, we're going to run this, and we basically skip over everything else in the loop. So a break will exit a loop, a continue will force it loop onto the next iteration, skipping over everything else that's kind of after it. Okay, so let's see what happens this time. We'll go ahead and run it. So 1, 2, 3, you collided with the enemy, and that's because that's supposed to be greater than 0. We'll go ahead and run it again. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so we reached the end, game over, we didn't collide with the enemy there. Okay, the reason again being that our Y position is going to be greater than 0. I mean, at all times, realistically, we change that in an actual game. And so we never ever end up kind of executing this code because our Y position is always going to be greater than 0. We're always going to continue there. All right, so that is pretty much all I wanted to cover. Realistically, this is a bit messy. You would definitely be able to implement this code to be a little bit cleaner, but I just wanted to demonstrate the continue and the break statements. Realistically, what we would do is we probably would eliminate this, and we just say if X position is equal to the enemy position and Y position is equal to the enemy Y position or something like that, then we would do this. We don't even really need this here, we just need to perform an extra check, but that's okay. Like I said, just wanted to demonstrate the use of the continue and the break statements there. Okay, so that is actually all I wanted to cover. So you now know how to use while loops. Again, just make sure that you design your while loops to have some kind of exit or some kind of break condition. You really don't want them to run forever. You want to make sure that at some point in time, something will happen to make that while loop break. It could run for 0 iterations. It could run for 1,000 iterations if you want. Okay, depends on the task you're trying to achieve. So I know this is kind of a weird concept. It took me a little bit to get loops, especially for loops, using the kind of the traditional syntax, but we don't have that here. So I'd really recommend that you play around with these loops a little bit. Try working with control flow within loops. Try using these continue break statements in some other examples. When you're ready to move on, we'll move to the next loop type, which will be for loops or for in loops. So stay tuned for those. Thanks for watching. See you guys in the next one.